Friends, good evening and welcome to the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church and to tonight's McClendon Scholar Program. I'm Reverend Sarah Johnson. I'm the senior pastor here at New York Avenue, and it is my privilege to welcome you wherever you are joining us tonight, whether that's in the DMV area, from another part of the country, or around the globe. We are so very glad that you are with us tonight. If you have joined us previously, you know that the mission of the McClendon Scholar Program invites scholars and leaders to share their learning and wisdom and insight about how the church can be more effective in its witness and its ministry. This program was established through the witness of the Reverend Dr. Jack McClendon and grows out of his insight that justice and service and action can only be sustained when a community works to deepen its faith and grapples with the profound issues of the day. Tonight's program is a wonderful opportunity to do that and to engage in such that way as we welcome Peter Canelos to speak to us about his book, The Great Dissenter. If you have read any or all of the book, you know that it is stunningly written. And it also is an informative look at the life and legacy of one of America's most important Supreme Court justices. But it also speaks to some of the imaginative possibilities of the connections between the political and moral and religious landscape in today's context, along with some interesting questions and thought-provoking ideas about the changing reach and influence of the court in today's world. You will also learn and hear a little bit more about that Justin Harlan was an active member of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church for more than 30 years. And so there is both an intellectual connection with tonight's event, but also one that is tangibly present for the church. As we begin our program tonight, let me lead us in a word of prayer. Let us pray. Oh God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. We come before you this night grateful for the opportunity to gather in a myriad of ways as we seek to listen and learn. Surprise and challenge us with a faith that seeks understanding, with new thinking and fresh ideas that help to broaden and inspire our understanding of you and of one another. Startle us this night with your truth and lead us in your way. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm going to hand the microphone over to my colleague, Theo Brown.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I want to also add my word of welcome, say how glad we are to have you with us this evening. As most of you know, the McClendon Scholar Program regularly hosts webinars and in-person events with prominent professors, authors, activists, and other thought leaders. And the primary reason we do this is in order to help us understand how people of faith can be more effective in working for justice in our society. Earlier this year, we started a somewhat new aspect of our program, having programs that focus on specific books that are relevant to and important to our work and the issues we're concerned in. Many of you may have joined us for the first program in this series back in the spring, featuring Kristen Kobs-DeMay, author of Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Tonight, in the second program in this series on books, we're looking at a book that focuses almost entirely on the subject of justice. In particular, what should be done from a legal standpoint to create a truly just and fair society. As Sarah mentioned, Peter Canelos' book, The Great Dissenter, story of John Marshall Harlan, America's judicial hero, is of particular interest to the McClendon Scholar Program since Justice Harlan was an active member of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church for more than 30 years. It's also of interest, of course, because many of the issues that he dealt with in the late 19th and early 20th century are still with us and being debated today. We welcome you to the program, whether you're from the DC area or around the country. One of the things about webinars is we can have participants from far-flung places. I see that many of you are already starting to type in your name and where you're from, and I invite you to do that in the chat function there at the bottom. to type in where you are and where you're joining us from. If you have a particular congregation or organization, you might mention that. And I also want to pose a question for you. As you type in where you're from or make a comment in chat, respond to this question. How much have you heard about Justice Harlan and his role in the struggle for civil rights? In many ways, he's a very important figure, but in other ways, not a figure well known to a lot of people. So type in, as you give your name, a little bit about what you've heard, whether it's a great deal or not very much, or in between, in terms of the role of Justice Harlan. You're certainly going to learn a lot about it tonight, but we're curious to know where you are as we begin. And of course, I see lots of responses coming in from congregations and people around the country. Many of you saying you've heard very little about Justice Harlan. I've heard nothing about him, someone says. Folks from DC, also other parts of the country checking in. Someone from Louisville, I see there. Someone from Philadelphia. So we do, and there are many more. And someone from Notre Dame. Glad to have someone from South Bend, Indiana, Flagstaff, Arizona. So you can see in the chat yourself, people are from many parts around the country tuning in, and we're glad to have all of you here. I see several people from Metropolitan AME Church, and we're going to mention a little bit about Metropolitan AME later, since that was a congregation also of importance to Justice Harlan. Continue to sign on where you're from and any comments you have about what you know about Justice Harlan as we begin. Our program format for the evening is very simple. In a few minutes, the great Dissenter, and then we'll have a fair amount of time after that to ask him some questions and talk with him. I have some questions prepared based on my reading of this really excellent book, and some others from New York Avenue Presbyterian have submitted some questions in advance, people who've also read the book. And then we're going to be inviting others of you to type questions into the Q&A function there at the bottom of the webinar, screen. Again, reminding you the difference, chat is for comments, like a response that I've asked for now, and I'm going to ask you a question at the end again to respond also in chat. And if you have something you really want to share, a thought or a resource, you can do that in chat, but save the Q&A for questions you have. And as Peter is talking, if a question occurs to you, type it in, or you'll have time when he and I are talking, but keep your questions just in Q&A and not in the chat function. Now, before we hear from Peter, we want to take a few minutes and share a little information with you about Justice Harlan and his relationship to the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. Since our church has been in its very prominent location just 3 blocks from the White House since 1859, there have been many members of our congregation who played a significant role in American history. Fortunately, we have an active history committee at our church that educates us about those who've gone before and some of the contributions they've made. Lynn Shabman is one of the active members of that history committee. And before I introduce Peter Canelos, he's going to take a few minutes to share some information about Justice Harlan and his relationship to the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church.
Thanks, Theo. I will take a few moments, as Theo said, and just try to orient you to New York Avenue's relationship to the Chief Justice, to the Justice Harlan. First slide, I think, would be helpful here. Yeah, so this is the church building John Marshall Harlan would have seen soon after he joined the Supreme Court. He surely must have had many matters to attend to as he settled in Washington, D.C. So why did he even bother to look for a church home? And I think the reason he bothered is captured in Harlan scholar James Gordon's article titled, and here's the title that I think explains much of his interest in church, Religion and First Justice Harlan, a case study in late 19th century Presbyterian institutionalism. Now relax, I'm not going to try to unpack that term for you, but I do want to pull from Gordon's Gordon first reminds the reader, I think, of something we need to keep in mind. He says, in our own secular and cynical age, it requires a self-conscious effort to appreciate the importance that religion played in the lives of most 19th century Americans. That's an important point. And then he goes on to kind of summarize his article. Next slide. Summarize basically a very article as follows. He says, as a devout and lifelong old school Presbyterian, Harlan's religious convictions shaped his style as a judge. They also provided him with a concrete standard against which to measure the rightness or wrongness of the world he saw around him, a standard he consciously or unconsciously applied in his public life. Harlan's religious identity influenced the way he thought about his country, drove his political choices at critical moments, and shaped his home life. And it was also central to understanding of himself. When Justice Harlan came to Washington, D.C., he only wanted to check out Abraham Lincoln's church. That's what we were at Lincoln's church. But what he found at New York Avenue was a Presbyterian faith community that aligned with his own understanding of Christianity and its relation to the state in 19th century America. Next slide. And he didn't just sign up to be a name on the church roster. During his tenure on the court, he made a significant commitment to serve on the governing boards of the church from 1880 until 1811. Any Presbyterians listening to this call will appreciate the time commitment he must have made. Here you see him seated with, yes, an all-male, it was the 19th century, session leadership for the 1903 church centennial photograph. Next. Here you see the New York Avenue sanctuary today with a plaque that is still on display, and the arrow points to it. This was a gift to the church in appreciation for Justice Harlan teaching the adult men's Bible study each Sunday, beginning in 1890, same year as the Plessy Dissent, and then through 1910. The plaque reads, "The Harlan Class Christmas 1910," meaning the Harlan class gave this plaque to the church on Christmas of 1910 and died just several months later. We have no readily accessible records of what he taught in that class. We can only speculate, but we do know he did it. Next slide. This is a cartoon drawing I took from Peter's book. I had never seen it before, and I think it's wonderful. It's showing Harlan promoting a Presbyterian, yes, cathedral. It's hard for Presbyterians to get their head around that idea, but a Presbyterian cathedral in Washington, D.C. Harlan believed that a construction of a Presbyterian cathedral profile of Presbyterianism and its social message in the public square. He felt that other denominations and other faith traditions were getting too much publicity. He felt so strongly that he agreed to leave the court, to resign, to lead the effort if it ever took root. This is an image of John Marshall Harlan's grave with a prominent Celtic cross. This cross is the cross most associated with the Presbyterian denomination. At the risk of a gross oversimplification to Peter, what in a nutshell was, going back to Gordon's article, late 19th century Presbyterian constitutionalism? What was that? And I obviously risk gross generalization here. First, by one interpretation, the writings of John, those in positions of power, like a justice of the Supreme Court, were expected to use that power to bring about, in the term that was widely used in the 19th century, the kingdom of God in the here and now. Second, but more to the point of Harlan's dissent, is that vision of the kingdom of God, as it was expressed by the social gospel movement of the late 19th and 20th centuries. The social gospel movement was led by clergy, many of whom were Presbyterians. In that period of time, from about the 1870s, finally culminated in the 1920s, who felt that charitable activities from churches were not enough. Instead, churches must point out the ills of society, such as unemployment, long hours of labor, and urban slums that made charity necessary. Social spokespersons were often highly critical of capitalism some calling their program for more just society Christian socialism. This is in the late 19th century. Surely Harlan was hearing this message, even if he may have rejected some of its particulars. Now, speaking of the gospel message were the pastors at New York Avenue, where Harlan was a church leader. Wallace Radcliffe urged the Presbyterian Church to speak out in favor of better housing, healthcare, and education for African Americans in the District of Columbia. Radford offered to exchange pulpits with the leading Presbyterian minister in Washington at that time, Francis Grimke, something that would have been bold in the very still segregated District of Columbia. In one letter to Grimke, Radcliffe said, and here I quote, "The only philosophy that will settle this race question is the philosophy of Christ. The only solution is to treat the Negro everywhere as a man and a brother." And then he concluded, "And it will certainly come, or the republic will go down." That's Wallace Radcliffe to Francis Grimke. Now, I'm not suggesting here Park Avenue Church was integrated. It was not. And I'm not suggesting that Harlan wanted or pushed for New York Avenue to seek out and admit Black members. I have no idea. But I am sure that whenever Harlan and Radcliffe addressed matters of race or the merits of the gospel in general, they were not preaching or to a completely convinced congregation or to an open-minded Supreme Court. But I have, for one, I have been motivated by Peter's excellent book to do more research both in our archives and from other sources to learn more about Harlan and his time at New York Avenue. So with that introduction to Harlan and New York Avenue, Theo, back to you.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation, and look forward to more digging into some things about his history and learning about that and sharing it as we go forward. My pleasure to introduce our speaker, our guest for this evening, to make a presentation and then to talk with us. Peter Canelos is currently the managing editor for Enterprise at Politico. Many of us are probably regular readers of Politico. I know that I am, and I follow closely their reporting on what is happening in the politics of our country. In that position, he oversees the site's magazine, the investigative journalism, and the other major special projects that they do. Peter is a native of Boston, and as I understand, a very serious Boston Red Sox fan. He is also a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia Law School. Instead of becoming a lawyer, he became a journalist and has had a long career, first at the Boston Globe, where he oversaw local news coverage and then was head of their Washington, D.C. bureau. He later became the Globe's editorial page editor, and for that work, he was recipient of the American Society of Newspaper Editors Award in 2011 for excellence in editorial writing. He also edited the Boston Globe's book, which many of you may be familiar with, Last Lion, The Fall and Rise of Ted Kennedy, which was a New York Times top 10 best-selling book in 2009. Peter spends a lot of time mentoring and encouraging young journalists, and for the past 12 years has worked with the International Women's Media Foundation, overseeing the Elizabeth Newfer Fellowship, which is given to an outstanding woman journalist from around the world to study human rights at MIT and to intern at the Boston Globe and the New York Times. Peter's book, The Great Dissenter, and here is the cover for those of you not familiar with it yet, was published last year to much critical acclaim and named one of the best nonfiction books of 2021. We're delighted to have Peter Canelos with us tonight and look forward to his comments and then to discussion with him afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Theo, for that wonderful introduction. We'll have to, I was a little surprised by that Red Sox part. This is the wrong year to tout your Red Sox fanship. But I also was fascinated by Len's presentation and And I thank you all so much for having me here. It really means a lot to be speaking to an audience who is sort of following in Harlan's footsteps today in New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, which meant so much to him. And also the many people we have from Metropolitan AME joining in, because Justice Harlan would regularly go and give talks at Metropolitan AME, and his late daughter, as we will see earlier, had taught at a predecessor church to Metropolitan AME, and there was a major memorial service, about 1,000 people in Washington for Justice Harlan at Metropolitan AME. So, and his funeral was at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. So these two religious institutions were absolutely central to his life and to his philosophy, I believe. Now, since many of you have said you didn't know too much about Justice Harlan or just heard a little bit about him through various media and things like that, I want to tell you why I think he's an important figure. He was on the Supreme Court at a very critical time from 1877 until 1911. That was basically between 120 and 150 years ago. So we know now what happened during that era that was historically important to the United States, and which things don't matter. I mean, imagine 150 years from now, people being able to look at our own era and answer some of these great questions that we all have in our own mind. The two things that happened during that time that really shaped America then, but also shaped America now, were the rise of segregation, when all of the gains, almost all of the gains that had come about through the Civil War were changed, reversed, and America entered into a long period of racial separation, the terrible effects of which I think we still are contending with today. The other major issue during that time that still bedevils us today was the rise in inequality in American life. You know, this was the era when the great industrialists were building mansions along the Hudson and in Newport and all over the country, modeled off of the, chateau of Louis XIV, while many of our immigrant ancestors were, living 3 and 4 and 5 to a room, even though they were all working because they couldn't afford anything better. And you had to say, how did that historic level of inequality come to take hold? And the answer is, when you look back historically, it wasn't that the presidents during that era, there were many presidents during the era, but it wasn't that any president, dramatically messed things up. And nor was it true that Congress did nothing to try to address these problems. At various key moments, Congress stepped up. So if you think about racial issues, Congress actually passed a Civil Rights Act in 1875 that guaranteed all Americans equal access to transportation and public accommodations, but the Supreme Court struck it down as unconstitutional. The 15th Amendment guarantees voting rights to all Americans. The state of Alabama passed a constitution that effectively denied voting rights to African Americans, and 1,500 regular voters who had, paid all their taxes, they were all literate, they were all experienced voters, sued to the Supreme Court for relief. Supreme Court said they can't grant any relief, it's a political question, and essentially punted. In the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, Louisiana tried to separate Black people and white people in various cars, and the Supreme Court said that's okay, which set in motion the legal architecture for segregation. On the economic side, you had this Congress again step up and pass the Sherman Antitrust Act, which would give the government the power to break up the trusts that were dominating American life and setting wages and prices and responsible for a lot of the income inequality. But the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. In the 1890s, Congress stepped up and passed an income tax, which would be a much fairer way of funding the federal government than tariffs. Tariffs used to be the sole source of funding for the government, but the same tariff, the same 1 penny tariff, would apply to the cup of coffee drunk by John D. Rockefeller and the cup of coffee drunk by some of those immigrants that we were talking about. That's the same penny, not the same percentage. the income tax, whatever its rate, was a far fairer way to fund the government, but the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. In this case of Lochner v. New York, you may have heard that name. Supreme Court declared that all labor laws across the state designed to protect labor were per se unconstitutional. This came about because states started trying to provide things like minimum wages and minimum hours for workers to try to protect them. Well, the common thread in all of those cases, the civil rights cases of 1883, the voting rights case of Giles v. Harris, the Plessy v. Ferguson, Lochner v. New York, the income tax case, the Pollock case, the declaring the Sherman Act unconstitutional, which was the E.C. Knight case. In all 6 of those cases, the one common thread was John Marshall Harlan dissented, and in most of them, he was the sole dissenter. So you have to go back and say, how did this one person see everything so differently from his colleagues, in most cases, all of his colleagues? And how did he then get proven to be right over time? And given that he was proven to be right over time, and in all of these cases, these are things that people right, left, and center, they wouldn't go back and relitigate these cases. In most cases, almost all Americans are now in Harlan's camp on these cases. You have to say, well, what was it that gave him the wisdom and the judgment and the courage to step forward and do this? And the answer was sort of the starting point for my book. And to answer it, you have to go deep into Harlan's life and look at all the influences that played on his jurisprudence. One influence was the pending Civil War. He was born in 1833, and he grew up in a family that was only in its 3rd generation in Kentucky, but was already one of the state's leading families. It was a family that knew that they were sort of creating this new state out of the wilderness of what was then the frontier. And they were proud of their education system. They were proud of their commitment to building institutions. They were proud of Presbyterian church that he went to as a young boy, and the college, Center College, or Presbyterian college that he would go to as a young man. His father, James Harlan, was the leading private attorney in Kentucky, and was in the course of building the largest private law library in the state, which of course empowered him as an attorney. And he was a true believer in the American Constitution. Part of the reason I think he was such a believer in the Constitution is that the Harlans, John Harlan and James Harlan, were sort of growing up in a period when there was a tremendous shadow over the United States, the threat of civil war. They saw to the South people claiming that they would be willing to secede from the Union rather than give up slavery. They saw from the North an increasing series of demands for abolition. And they knew sort of in their bones that Kentucky, which was directly between the North and South, would be a key battleground in this war and perhaps destroyed. They also knew that their own state, which harbored some Northern and Southern sympathies, the civic fabric of that state would be sort of torn asunder. So if you put yourself in the position of young John Harlan, he's growing up revering the founding fathers, revering the Constitution, revering the Declaration of Independence, and believing innately that America was the great hope for all of mankind, because in that era, everybody else in the world was governed by some form of despotism, some form of monarchy, emperorship, authoritarianism, and America was the great hope for democracy. And he really, really, really believed that. But he also sensed that there was this terrible threat coming. So the Harlans played a key role in trying to craft compromises that would prevent the war. Their basic posture on slavery was that it was an institution that had outlived its usefulness, but that needed some time for it to end. So the Harlans were behind their great fellow Kentuckian Henry Clay in some of his efforts to craft compromises like the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, things that sort of tried to establish a geographic balance between North and South. They also were involved in the Colonization Society, which, although very misguided, was trying to provide an opportunity for enslaved people to move to Liberia. And they also were exploring methods of sort of compensating slave owners to allow for a more gradual emancipation that would have less of an economic problem in the South, create less of an economic problem in the South. None of these compromises worked. And in fact, the moment when John Harlan, as a very young man, realized that they wouldn't work was when the Supreme Court stepped forward in the Dred Scott case and went beyond all evidence and all necessity in terms of settling the case involving a slave in the North, an enslaved man in the North, formerly enslaved man in the North, who was suing for his freedom, to declare that no Black people, free Black people or enslaved Black people, could ever have any constitutional rights under the Constitution. It was a disastrous, crazy ruling because in many of the states that had ratified the Constitution, Black people had equal rights. So it was a disastrous, bad decision under the law. And I think that John Harlan knew in his bones that when the Supreme Court got it wrong, he knew that all those compromises would fail and that war would come. That was a very important formative feeling period in his life. And I think it's one reason why when people say, well, how did he ever get the courage to be such a great dissenter? I think he came to understand the stakes in Supreme Court decisions, that, lives were lost, that the country was almost destroyed by a mistaken Supreme Court decision. So you can't keep quiet. He also learned the limits of compromise. It's very, very hard to sort of put the genie back in the bottle when a dispute started. And he eventually came to believe that slavery was the great mistake of the founding fathers, that they had not resolved it at the time of the founding of the country, and that it's far easier to solve a problem at stage one than to try to undo the damage later on or craft compromises to sort of deal with the effects. So he became more courageous, he became more forthright. And I think the stakes were also hammered home during the Civil War and the period immediately before the Civil War, when he, who was trained to be a lawyer, who was trained to be a politician, who was already a rising star in Kentucky, was forced to become a man of action. He literally went to the streets of Louisville with a bullhorn in his hand, standing alongside the brothers James and Joshua Speed, who were the few Lincoln supporters, among the few Lincoln supporters in Kentucky, and implored the citizens of Kentucky to stay neutral in the Civil War. He recalled sleeping on the floors of the State House in Frankfort, Kentucky, because the state's Confederate sympathizer governor, Beriah McGoffin, was trying to get legislators to agree to secede and join the Confederacy. They were under intense pressure to join the Confederacy. There were many other things that Harlan did. He and his father even accepted guns that were sent from the Lincoln administration in case the Confederacy ever invaded Kentucky to try to protect the state. He succeeded in keeping Kentucky neutral, and Kentucky later became loyal to the Union. And he himself went and used his own good name and reputation, recruited an 800-person regiment that he led in the Civil War as a colonel and saw 2+ years of combat in the Civil War. He would recall, stepping over bodies, including the bodies of people that he knew, because in Kentucky, you knew a lot of the Confederates and the Confederate leaders. They were your friends, they were your fellow politicians. And recall sort of seeing death firsthand, which he did, and he saw lots of combat in his own regiment as well, and received many, many commendations for valor, and in fact was in line to become a general. And when he had to leave the military because of the untimely death of his father. Now, there's another reason why John Harlan saw things differently than his contemporaries, and I think this was an even bigger influence on John Harlan. And that is that there was another man growing up in that household, older than John, named Robert Harlan, who was technically enslaved in the household, but treated more like a family member. And Robert Harlan himself became a famous, well-known man, and was often, his own background was a subject of a lot of speculation that John Harlan would have heard about as he was growing up. Robert Harlan came to Kentucky when he was 8 years old. He and his mother, who was an enslaved woman of mixed race, made a trip from Mecklenburg County, Virginia, to Kentucky, about 450 miles, to try to find Robert's father. And that was the account that appeared in many newspaper profiles of Robert after he became a prominent man later in his life. Well, where did they go in Kentucky? They went to a place called Harlan Station, which was a family town essentially made up just of Harlan relatives. So obviously they felt that Robert's father was a member of the Harlan family. In addition, James Harlan's mother, Sarah Caldwell, came from Mecklenburg County, and her family owned a plantation there. So it was often speculated that James Harlan, who was only 16 when Robert was born, may have been Robert's father. I think it's equally likely that James Harlan believed that that his own father, who had been alive when Robert was born, but had died in the intervening 8 years, may have been Robert's father. But one way or the other, Robert ended up in James Harlan's house, and a special favorite of James Harlan. James Harlan tried to educate Robert, but Robert was rejected from school because he was African American. Paradoxically, that rejection from school freed him up in one way, and that is that James Harlan, who ended up having 9 children with his wife Eliza, believed that all of the boys in the family should be trained as lawyers, and he had them all doing this sort of cloistered treatment of study, where they were pretty much, training to be lawyers from the time they were 5 years old and had very little fun in their lives. Robert Harlan, since he was not allowed to go to school, developed a sixth sense. He was allowed to sort of spread his wings a little bit more, and he developed a sixth sense for ways that African Americans could succeed against the greatest odds known to mankind. And you have to say slavery was probably the greatest odds to have to overcome for anybody at that in American history. And the first place where Robert Harlan found such an opportunity was the horse racing industry in Kentucky, which was just getting started then. But because a lot of the horse owners were also slave owners, the enslaved men were the jockeys and trainers. And so Robert sensed that this was a place where a Black person could get a fair shake. And he developed a reputation that he would carry for the rest of his life of always being able to size up a horse from sight and pick, by looking at the horse's haunches, you could pick which one was going to win the race. He also helped stage races, which was something of a dangerous thing at that time, because you had to be able to enforce betting rules, and you had to be able to collect the winnings and distribute the money and make sure that everyone followed the rules. So if you're young John Harlan, who was 16 years younger than Robert, think of you as a 4 or 5, 6-year-old, seeing Robert come home at night from these races with his satchel full of money on a giant horse. Robert, who was known for his handsome look and his aggressiveness and his virile presence. I think that Robert was sort of almost like an uncle figure to John in that family, and he would look at him and see this sort of man of action. For Robert Harlan, that sense of figuring out ways and places where Black people could succeed carried him through to wealth early in his life. From the time in 1849 that he heard about the gold rush, he was one of the first Kentuckians to get on a boat, travel all the way down Mississippi River to New Orleans, go from New Orleans to Panama City, then cross all of Panama, crossing rainforests and mountains and jungles to get to the West Coast, and then make what was then even a perilous trip up to San Francisco. And we knew that he came back with what was, in today's dollars, $4 to $6 million in gold. He probably earned a lot of it selling lumber. There was a time of tremendous inflation, obviously, in San Francisco. But he also sensed that because people were coming in from Asia, from Europe, from all these other places, this was a place where the old strictures would not apply, where a Black person would actually have a chance. And he was right, and he was able to build a fortune that way. He then moved to Cincinnati, which was then the terminus of the Underground Railroad, and also the place where free Black people would come out of the South. And he saw in those migrants a great new workforce and economic opportunity. So he invested in Black-owned businesses. He invested in businesses as simple as a grocery, but as complicated and forward-looking as a photography studio, because in 1851, when he was still a very young man, and it was just after he had made his riches, he gave himself a trip to Europe. He went to England when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were putting on what was called the Crystal Palace exhibition, which was supposed to showcase the wonders of the new industrial world. And what did he see in the Crystal Palace but pictures of Cincinnati? He understood that Cincinnati was home to pioneering photographers, many of them African Americans, and he would build a studio. And so some of the great pioneering photographers who also happened to be Black people did their work out of Robert Harlan's studio. He also held the mortgage on a place called the Dumas House that was the leading hotel for Black people in Cincinnati, and also a place where runaways were stored and hidden in the basement. So he was this great man of action in Cincinnati. He then spent the Civil War years in England staging races in which he bought Kentucky horses, brought them to England, and challenged the greats of British racing in this sort of, US versus Europe kind of contest in the sport of kings. And even though he did not have a whole lot of success with his own horses, he became a very respected figure in Europe and a well-known figure in horse racing, so that when he finally came back to Cincinnati after the Civil War, there were stories in British media, throughout British media, including the racing media, but also the mainstream media, about what a fine man Robert Harlan was and how they would miss him. He was such a fixture at every race course and stuff. So Robert Harlan returns to Cincinnati after the war and becomes the leading Black politician in Cincinnati and the leading Black politician in Ohio, which gives him an unusual position of power because Ohio was the swing state in presidential politics. It's why there were so many presidents from Ohio during that period. And the Black vote in Ohio was the difference maker between Republicans and Democrats. Remember, in those days, Black voters and Black rights were supported by the Republican Party and not the Democratic Party. And it was the Black vote in Ohio that enabled the Republicans to stay in power. So Robert Harlan had this great position of power in Ohio, which does not minimize the tremendous racism that he faced, but he was a man of privilege, a man of distinction, a man of worldly respect. And he was somebody who was on a first name basis with some of the presidents of that era and the leading Republican politicians who had to cultivate his support. So he was in a position to help John Marshall Harlan become a Supreme Court justice. Now, you would think for Robert, having been born enslaved in that house and having faced the discrimination of not being allowed to go to school and other things, he might have just wanted to, get out of Kentucky and never think about it again. But he actually maintained close ties to the white side of the Harlan family. When John Harlan's older sister, Elizabeth, was married, she was a music lover, and they used to display the wedding gifts out there. The most prominent wedding gift was from Robert, who was then the richest member of the family. He gave a handmade piano to Elizabeth. When one of John's brothers, James Jr., became an alcoholic and suffered greatly, Robert contributed money and advice to help James Harlan try to get straight. With John, Robert Harlan worked with him politically and tried to help him out of a very awkward situation when a cousin on his mother's side was arrested for shooting a prominent Black official in Washington in a case that could have really hurt John's future political career, but Robert kind of smoothed the waters and made everything work. So then you get to 1876, and as we know, there was a disputed presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. And that 1876 election was sort of the fulcrum on which a lot of American history turned. And we know that there were dueling sets of electors that were sent up from 3 southern states that would have made the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. And we know that there was lobbying that went on in the then center of the lobbying world, the Willard Hotel, the old Willard in Washington, where in smoke-filled rooms a deal was cut to give Hayes the presidency. Now, the most salient part of that deal was to remove troops from the South that had been protecting the rights of Black people in the South. Another deal that got less attention was to put a Southerner on the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court was all Northerners, and it was all essentially corporate lawyers who had been put on the court after the Lincoln administration and the Andrew Johnson administration and Grant. And the South had no representation. It was like people who thought alike and who had very different views from the rest of the country. But Hayes immediately had a problem because then, as now, the Senate Judiciary Committee was not about to rubber stamp his choice. And the Senate Judiciary Committee was controlled by the so-called radical Republicans who were strong supporters of civil rights. And they had real doubts about John Harlan because, after all, he had not been an abolitionist before the Civil War. He had been trying these compromises. He'd been trying to forestall the war. He was not calling for immediate emancipation. So he was held in a measure of suspicion. Now, we know that Robert Harlan came down from Ohio to Washington and helped talk up John as a presidential candidate, as a Supreme Court candidate, because he was sending letters back to John saying that. We don't know the impact that Robert had on that decision, but if the prime argument against him was that he would be insufficiently supportive of civil rights, having the leading Black politician in Ohio who grew up in the same home say you can trust this man, I think made a big difference. Now, John Harlan, in his first 6 years on the Supreme Court, was kind of the junior member. The Chief Justice at the time, Morrison Waite, was a sort of consensus building figure who really hated the idea of dissent and tried to persuade the court to speak as much as possible with one voice. And John went along with that. In 1883, however, came along the most high profile, the biggest case that would ever come up on his tenure on the Supreme Court, and he had to know it. Civil rights cases of 1883. This was the case that examined the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And what had happened is, after that national Civil Rights Act had passed, guaranteeing Black people access to public accommodations and transportation, individual white officials in a lot of states, both in the North and the South, just on their own fiat started refusing to serve Black people. Generally in theaters, often in restaurants, sometimes in hotels. So all these cases got bundled together into one case that was put before the Supreme Court. And by 1883, the country had lost, the white portion of the country had lost patience with defending Black rights. And so this case became front page news all around the country. Plessy v. Ferguson, which you remember today more, was a backwater case that no one paid attention to. But the civil rights cases of 1883 was a national requiem on civil rights, a major moment. And the court wanted to speak with one voice, but in this case, that voice was going to invalidate that Civil Rights Act of 1875 on the grounds that the federal government only had power to restrain states. It did not have power to restrain individuals who would discriminate against Black people. Now, John Harlan knew that the post-Civil War amendments had been passed specifically with the idea of validating an earlier Civil Rights Act, and that it was supposed to change the relationship between the federal government and the states, and that it was supposed to elevate Black people to a status of equality. So he sensed immediately that the court was doing something that was in violation of the specific intent and the specific language of the Constitution. He also felt in his bones that this was going to damage the country, that it was going to invalidate that the only purpose of the Civil War was to resolve this racial question in the United States. And here we were opening it up again by allowing discrimination to exist in this country, and potentially segregation as it went forward. So he really labored over this decision, and he was under intense pressure to join with the court's majority. And several things impacted him. Well, you've got to imagine, first of all, here was a man who knew Robert Harlan. He knew that when Black people's rights were protected, Robert Harlan was able to go to the top of the queue. He was the most successful man in the family. He was the richest and most enterprising figure. So I think a lot of the Northern justices who had that great abolition record before the Civil War had no personal experience of Black people. So they fell prey to a lot of the sort of bad dope that was going around during that period, racist dope about how, slavery had held Black people in a childlike state and they couldn't really exercise full citizenship, or that there were racial differences and inferiorities in play here. Harlan knew that was totally unrealistic, totally wrong. And he also felt that what was being done was just morally wrong to Black people, and he included moral language in his dissent. And the dissent that he issued was a long, kind of epic dissent that addressed many of these fundamental questions of how to interpret the post-Civil War amendments. And he came out on the opposite side of the majority. And the doctrines that he sketched in that dissent were later used in the 20th century to validate the Civil Rights Act of 1964, among other things. So he was vindicated on the law, and he was vindicated in spirit from his dissent in the civil rights case of 1883. It's not as famous as his Plessy dissent, but it was very famous nonetheless. By the time of Plessy v. Ferguson, the country, black and white, was so inured to the idea that the Supreme Court was not going to support black people that, first of all, even black leaders bemoaned the fact that they were even bringing this case because they felt only bad things could come from it. Harlan had also dissented in cases like that voting rights case that we talked about and other cases that took away black rights. So by then he was kind of, we're talking 12 years of frustration in seeing his colleagues repeatedly make what he considered the same mistake, and a terrible mistake by denying equality. He believed it affected all Americans, not just black people, everywhere affected all Americans. So his dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson dug a little bit deeper than his dissent in the civil rights case of 1883. He'd already sketched out some of the legal doctrines that he believed. And this was a dissent that was more of a moral condemnation. It included some very memorable lines like, the Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. There is no caste here. These are the kinds of lines that you could etch on the side of a building, the kind of lines that change people's minds, force people to pay attention. There are also lines that sort of dig deep into the fabric of American history. Now, among the lawyers here who are in the audience, you know that it's very rare to find a legal opinion that doesn't sort of parse statutory or constitutional provisions. This was going to the foundational principles of the country. This was going to the foundational principles that he, as a child, when there were still Revolutionary War veterans still alive, there were still framers alive when he was born, he knew and sensed that this destroying and taking away of black rights was fundamentally damaging America and violating the core principles of America and American history. So what he was saying in that dissent was, this doesn't just violate the plain language of the Constitution, which has an equal protection clause. It doesn't just violate the sort of spirit of the Constitution, which was created after the Civil War, remade after the Civil War to protect black rights. It violates the fundamental principles of the United States. The whole thing that makes us Americans is being offended in this case. Now, one of the things that we discovered in writing the book, and I say we because I also worked with some young researchers who did great work excavating information from, among other things, black newspapers that have recently become digitized and were a wonderful source of information, horse racing journals, other things. But we know that Harlan's dissents were discussed widely. Many people in the law regard these dissents as sort of a dead letter, but Harlan's dissents made a difference. And they made a difference in the economic cases and in the race cases. So, for example, in his dissent in the income tax case, it was read on the floor of the House of Representatives to try to implore the House to pass a constitutional amendment and send it to the states to allow income taxes to be restored in the United States as a fairer way of administering the government. And one of the things in that dissent was that he warned about what would happen in the state of a world war when there would be no more trading and therefore no more tariff income, that the United States would be helpless in that situation. So the 16th Amendment passed in 1913, just a few years before the start of World War I, where Harlan's prophecy probably would have come true. But it was in the race cases that his dissents made the greatest difference. Now we know that when Harlan died in 1911, and his funeral was right here at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, in the white community he was deeply mourned, and he was deeply mourned in people in Washington who knew him personally. But there was a sense of grief that was far more fervent and far more urgent in the Black community. So in cities all around the country, including places that Harlan had never visited, there were spontaneous services in Black churches to pray for his soul. And in those Black newspapers, there were editorials saying, who now is going to speak for our people without Justice Harlan? He was the one white official who saw things through Black people's eyes. There were 3 of those memorial services spontaneously in Washington, D.C. at different churches. And then they had a combined memorial service at Metropolitan AME attended by all Black people. No white people came, not members of the family or anybody. It was just Black people there. 1,000 people came, and Harlan's dissents were read aloud. Those phrases, the Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. And put yourself in the position of a young person in that service thinking about going into the law and finding ways to challenge some of these terrible decisions that held Black people back. And Harlan's words were an inspiration. Thurgood Marshall was born 2 years after Harlan died, so he didn't have a chance to go to that service, but he himself read Harlan's dissents as part of his own legal education. In the 1930s and 40s, he had to go to small towns in the South to try to recruit Black families to challenge segregation, usually by challenging admissions policies at the local university. And in these towns, the Ku Klux Klan was essentially a law unto itself, standing guard, ready to try to punish anybody who defied its wishes. And Thurgood Marshall cited Harlan's dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson as an example of how at least one white person, one white jurist could see things differently than the Supreme Court had seen, the Supreme Court majority had seen it, and that this was something to build on. So he convinced people that challenging segregation was not futile. Constance Baker Motley, who was one of the key lieutenants of Thurgood Marshall, she has written that his dissent in Plessy was Thurgood Marshall's Bible. It was the inspiration for the entire NAACP Legal Defense Fund. It was quoted specifically in all of their briefs challenging segregation, including in Brown v. Board of Education, which in 1954 finally overturned the Plessy case. The editorial in the New York Times the next day was headlined "Justice Harlan Concurring," and was talking about Harlan as the lone voice in the wilderness who had stood up against this case and finally was vindicated by history. I think that when people assess Harlan's record, and we're going to have a nice chance to chat about it, I'm sure Theo has a lot of great questions on that. But I think one thing that people have to consider is, what if Harlan hadn't existed? What if all of those cases, especially the race cases, had been unanimous? What would the feeling have been in the Black community? Would there have been enough faith in the law to even stand up and challenge some of those provisions? How much deeper would the sense of distrust between white people and Black people have been if those cases taking away all Black rights, cases that we now regard as anathema, terrible cases, abominations, if those cases had been unanimous? I think that Harlan's willingness to stand up as a white person and support civil rights, support voting rights, support equal treatment under the law was a sort of great act in American history that helped to preserve faith in the law and helped to set in motion changes in the law that are vital and important. So with that, I'd love to hear your questions, Theo, and I'm sure people in the audience have a lot of questions too.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Peter. There's so much in your book. Appreciate you touching on so many points. And then, of course, there are a lot of things you weren't able to get to. That's why I'll just tell everybody they need to read your book and see even more. I was struck by your comments, and as I read the book, about the reaction in the Black press at the time and how different that was to how this was all received in so-called the mainstream press. Say a little bit more about the research into that. And were you surprised what you found as you looked into some of these older, more sort of obscure Black newspapers of the time, and how important Harlan was to them?
Yes, I was surprised, because when I first conceived of doing this book, and it had sort of been germinating for a long time, it was around 2005 to 2009, in that period. And a lot of these Black newspapers had not been digitized at that point. And so in talking to people about the book and things like that, people would say, well, Robert Harlan, is there any information about who Robert Harlan was? And John Harlan's dissent, it's good for him that he saw the law properly, and we all admire that, but did it really have any effect? And it wasn't until those newspapers were digitized that you could really reenact some of the discussions within the Black community. And there was a lot of discussion within the Black community, and that was a time, those of you who are historians of that period, when there were a lot of disagreements among Black leaders about the proper path forward. And Robert Harlan played a significant role in those discussions. But John Marshall Harlan's dissents, were very carefully parsed. There were individual stories about Harlan's dissents every time they came down, while they got no attention in the white mainstream press.
Yeah.
Basically none. So that was very, very much noteworthy. The other thing that was very interesting about the reaction among Black newspapers and Black people, so there were often editorials that spoke of his courage and said that, the courage it took to stand up to his white colleagues. Now, in my own research, I didn't find a lot of evidence of like Harlan's life being threatened or Harlan being, the subject of hate mail and things like that. He may well have been. I mean, there's a lot of reason why that would not have been saved and would not have come down over time. I think that the reality was closer, at least in official, kind of upscale white circles. Harlan was such an outlier that he wasn't threatening to the white community. It's like they were sort of like, okay, well, Harlan's having his own cranky different view here. He was not necessarily exiled and chastised for those views. I'm sure he was to some extent, but not that wasn't the dominant feeling. Yet in the Black community, there was a belief that he was really almost putting his life on the line to take these positions, which I think tells you that the extent to which Black people felt that there was a conspiracy among white people to deny them rights, that this was almost like a monolithic white position that was, the white people of America were in unison denying them rights, and that Harlan was this extraordinary figure who was willing to stand up and say, no, this is the wrong policy. And so they admired his courage greatly, but imagined that he was really putting himself on the line in a way that maybe he wasn't. It's hard to know.
Yeah, and it's ironic that, as you point out and you say more in your book, that he was not trusted by Northern liberals, the more radical Republicans, when they named him to the court. Hayes wanted to name a Southerner, and so he named him, and he had opposed Lincoln's reelection. He voted for McClellan, evidently, and he had originally opposed the 13th Amendment, and yet he comes to the court as the only Southerner, and he becomes this great champion of civil rights. Could this have been predicted by those who know him at the time, or do you think it was a surprise to everyone?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I think other people who've studied Harlan's career express sort of shock at this. They see it as a story of a man who had these sort of very wrong-headed views and then suddenly had this sort of almost religious conversion to become an advocate for civil rights. I see it as being a little bit less dramatic than that, because Harlan's positions before the Civil War were not really embracing of slavery. I think that he felt slavery was a wrong at that time. He just felt that there needed to be a way to deal with it that was not a war that killed 600,000 people in the battlefield. I think that his other feelings, when you talk about supporting McClellan and supporting and initially opposing some of the ratification of those post-war amendments, came about because he was the elected Attorney General of Kentucky in 1864 and 65, and the state had been put under martial law by the federal government. Now, there may have been good reasons to put it under martial law because there were a lot of Confederate sympathizers in Kentucky, and it was wartime. But Harlan felt that it was an unnecessary step, and that it was something that violated his own personal assurances to his friends and neighbors that if Kentucky remained neutral, if Kentucky remained loyal to the federal government, it could choose its own path, that it was not going to be treated like a captured territory, but it was put under the military ran Kentucky. He also felt, as the elected Attorney General, he had to stand up for democracy in that case and for the people of Kentucky. So some of those positions reflected both his own frustration with the federal government, but also in his belief that it had personally betrayed him almost, but also his sense of obligation to folks in Kentucky to challenge these laws that they found very, very onerous. He, by 1867, 68, he was ready to make a conversion to Republicanism that was a courageous stance in Kentucky because the Republicans had no support in Kentucky. He had been part of was considered a conservative unionist party that was sort of about as far in the Republican direction as Kentuckians are willing to go. The National Republican Party was not popular at all in Kentucky. Lincoln got 5% in the vote of the voting. So as soon as Harlan declared himself to be part of the Republican Party, he essentially counted himself out of Kentucky politics, and his future became in the National Republican Party. And that's why Robert Harlan was so protective of his reputation nationally, because he knew that that's where John's focus was.
He was clearly an individual who was influenced. I mean, we all are, but you see it so clearly in his life by his own life experience. And you talk about Robert Harlan and the example he gave. It was sort of a living refutation of the idea of Black inferiority. Obviously, his Presbyterian faith had a real impact on the moral principles. You also talk about the impact of the death of his daughter, Edith, who was evidently his really, favorite child, and was married at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, moved away, I believe, to Indiana, and then tragically became ill and died very soon after. And the funeral was at New York Avenue again. But you mentioned that this had a big impact on him, and that he sort of kept her in mind. And say a little bit about that. How was her death an influence on Harlan?
This had an enormous influence on him. And people who came from large families in that era often lost relatives to infectious disease. I think something that we during the COVID pandemic have come to be more aware of is that terrible threat. But that was a daily threat to people in that era. And Harlan he and his wife Malvina had 6 children. They had a very loving marriage and a very large, happy family. And their eldest child was this daughter, Edith, followed pretty close order by 3 boys. And they talked about Edith as being kind of the center of the family because she worked very closely with her mother, Malvina, in the very onerous entertainments that were required of Supreme Court justices during that time. You had to have a party every week, an open house for as many as 200 and 300 people. And the Harlans did not have a lot of money. The other justices, the corporate lawyers, had lived in mansions and had great riches for that era. Harlan did not, but he had this terrible, onerous, social burden. But Edith, who was a lovely piano player and singer and things like that, would work with her mother to try to make these very memorable events. She also was known for her, her kindness, her fine spirit, and being sort of almost like a second mother to the 3 brothers that came after her. She, as you mentioned, was married in New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in what was really a joyful event for that family. She married a man named Linus Child, who was from Massachusetts, but he was sort of a young up-and-coming lawyer and headed west, like a lot of lawyers did during that period. They came from the Northeast, but they would make practices in the West where there was all this business that was suddenly growing up and developing. So they left their parents, and she became pregnant, and she presented them with a granddaughter, and then within 6 months after the baby was born, she became ill with typhoid fever. And John and Malvina Harlan, got on a train and headed to Chicago. They were in the Chicago area, and got there just in time as she was dying. And John Harlan was tremendously grief-stricken. He wrote a letter to the 3 sons who were in college at the time, saying that every day of his life he would spend vindicating her principles, trying to live up to her fine character, called her the greatest angel that had ever lived, and that he could never equal her goodness. Now, one of the things that she had done was that she had taught the children of freedmen and women at Bethel Industrial School, which was associated with the predecessor church of Metropolitan AME. So that was the time of the civil rights cases of 1883, when Harlan made his big break with the Supreme Court, when he became the great dissenter. In fact, in that, they were living at that time on Massachusetts Avenue here in Washington in a rented house, and he wrote that dissent in an upstairs study that was torturous for him, because he felt that the house was haunted by Edith's presence, and it was so so much a part of their lives that they like had to leave the house shortly afterwards because both parents were so troubled by the sense that they were every day confronting, the places where Edith had been. So this was a profound case in his life. And as Malvina later wrote, and her mother wrote, that they had this joyful event at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church with the sons as attendants and Linus Child's family as attendants. And she describes the very simple, unadorned marriage procedure that she Edith chose to sort of reflect her modesty. And then amazingly, just a year and a half later, there they were again at her funeral, the same people as pallbearers, the same brothers there. And the one thing that the Harlan parents were able to do is they, since Linus Child was a young man at the time and everything, they persuaded him to allow them to raise the granddaughter, also named Edith, who they raised as a daughter after her death.
There are a couple of questions, people mentioning and wanting to know more about Robert Harlan. And one of our members, Jim Martin at New York Avenue, asked a question about this. He quotes you as saying, "There's a mystery to Harlan's story. Its solution lies in the person of Robert Harlan." And you've already mentioned how important he was. Someone else asks in a question here, are there descendants still alive? And of course, at the end of the book, you talk about some of the descendants and this whole question. And Jim asks, at the end of the book, you mentioned that a DNA test was taken to see if, in fact, they could prove that he was biologically related. It was inconclusive, certainly didn't show that he was. But Jim Martin asked, do you think John Marshall Harlan considered Robert his biological brother? Do you have a sense of how he held that or what he thought?
I think that we can surmise that both Robert and John Harlan would have certainly heard these rumors. And this wasn't just, in Black newspapers, it was sort of stated as a fact that Robert was the son of James Harlan in some Black newspapers. And this was in Robert's lifetime. So Robert could have corrected the record if he wanted to. It also was stated in racing journals and in one case in the Louisville Courier Journal that Robert was the son of James Harlan. So they obviously were aware of this, intensely aware of this. And it reflects also, it says something about their relationship, that they maintained a somewhat loyal familial tie, even though these rumors were buzzing around in a way that was probably hurtful and damaging to both sides. In terms of what they saw, obviously they didn't have the benefit of DNA, and they had grown up in the same house, and clearly Robert Harlan regarded James Harlan as his father figure, whether he was actually his biological father or not. The DNA test that you referred to was a very early DNA test because it had to go along the male line, and so they had a distant cousin of John Marshall Harlan's, and they had a descendant of Robert Harlan's, and it discouraged the idea that there was a family tie. So it was something that was a little surprising because both families were expecting it to show that they were related. The Robert Harlan line and the Robert Harlan family plays a large role in the second half of my book. And Theo, you're right that there's a lot in the story that we can't get to in these kinds of things. And they're amazing cases and instances. There was a case in Chattanooga, a lynching case that Harlan really stuck his neck out to sort of support a lynching victim and to demand justice there that is its own narrative by itself.
An extraordinary story. I was so struck by that Ed Johnson story and the memorial that has now been erected in Chattanooga as a result of that. And it is a case where Harlan tried to stop the execution, and then the man was lynched after Harlan tried to stop the actual execution.
Well, and Harlan then intervened to sort of finish the story to make sure that the officials in Chattanooga who were responsible for allowing this lynching to take place, they were tried. They actually had the Supreme Court sit as a trial court and convict them of crimes. And the fact that they were able to do this research and they were able to come up with a record that implicated so many corners of Chattanooga society in this terrible lynching that took place right in the middle of the city, and their leading monument I think, enabled Chattanooga to come together in the last few years and erect a monument to the lynching victim, which also honors Harlan.
Yeah.
And so it was a deceptively sort of great act, but there are many of those kinds of stories that we can't quite get into, even with all the time that we have.
Yeah.
But I was also going to say that part of it is also the role that Robert Harlan's family and descendants played in sort of showing the tragic cost of segregation. One of the great poignant aspects of Robert Harlan's life was that he believed that in one generation, Black people would achieve equality if they committed themselves to education. He never had a day of schooling, but he was a prime advocate for education. He was founded the first school for colored children in Cincinnati. And his own son, Robert Jr., was his perfect illustration of that. A man who went to college, who went to law school, became erudite. He was known for performing in Gilbert and Sullivan operettas and things like that, and was very much part of the sort of aristocracy of the Black community, and married a woman who also came from a well-off family. And yet the descendants of Robert Harlan continued to be well-educated, and they continued to be leaders in the Black community, but because of segregation, there was no money. And they eventually led these very challenged lives because of legal segregation closing in on them. And the great, irony is that Robert himself actually had more freedom in those few years after the Civil War than his descendants had.
So many interesting cases that he dealt with, and you've touched on some. We can only mention maybe a few others, but John O'Brien, also longtime New York Avenue member, had a question about the case, the Mormon polygamy case, and Harlan's role in that, and the distinction that was made between the First Amendment protecting religious views, but not necessarily religious practice, as I understand it. And just briefly, what could you say about that? And were there other things that you learned about his views on religious liberty that you would share?
I can share a little bit. He in the Mormon case, the polygamy case, which was very early in his tenure on the Supreme Court, he joined the court majority in that case, in a case that laid down an important distinction, which is that you have the right to worship as you see fit, but religious practices can still violate other laws and other aspects of the Constitution. And this is a precedent that is somewhat under attack now, as people try to find new justifications for supporting what people claim are religious practices, but often violate discrimination laws and other provisions. So that was a very important case early in his tenure, but it was a case when he was in the court majority. In terms of the role of religion in his life, as I have told people like Glenn and others, I'm not a theologian, so I of all the aspects of the Harlan story, this is the one that is the hardest in some ways to parse, and also because people don't talk about religion in their legal opinions, so you can only sort of speculate at how it would have played a role. And the conclusion I came to, which is very, I think, similar to what Len was saying earlier, was that he came to believe in the doctrine that we on earth can advance the will of God by standing up for the will of God, that there's an agency there that we are helping to preserve God's teachings in our own lives. And that could easily have motivated him and certainly been a contributing factor in many of these dissents that we have talked about. Paradoxically, there was also a doctrine that may have guided him in the years when he was personally opposed to slavery, but also willing to accept compromises. So people say, well, how could you be opposed to slavery and still believe in these compromises and not be out there campaigning for abolition? Well, there are a lot of reasons for that, including how embedded it was in the South, but and the fear of disruption and war that would have go along with that. But there was another one. His church had taught, the church in Danville, Kentucky, that he had gone to. The pastor there had taught that God has his own plans. And so I think that John Harlan could have believed that God had a plan to eliminate slavery that you could trust. So you could you could be against slavery, but you could also be against this form of abolition that would divide and tear apart the country, but still believe that eventually in God's plan, slavery would disappear. That was just another place where religion seemed to enter in his life. He also, the same minister who was part of his childhood, an important part of his childhood, because he was also the minister who was the president of Center College, where he went to college, delivered a very famous and widely published sermon about the obligations of masters and servants. But it was a sly thing. If you read it today, it'll sound very kind of questionable, and why are we saying there are masters and servants in the world? But it was essentially imploring masters to treat their servants as they would want themselves to be treated, that there was a reciprocal relationship there, and that the positive, uplifting treatment of servants was part of that responsibility of masters. But it was a sermon that played a role in sort of, liberalizing attitudes towards slavery, but stopped short of calling for an immediate abolition, for sure.
Yeah. You mentioned and there are some parallels between the Supreme Court in the Harlan era and the Supreme Court today. I think one of the things you're talking about is that there were actually relatively liberal laws passed by the Congress back in the late 1800s, and they got overturned by the court. That has happened on some issues here, most recently the Dobbs decision, certainly, maybe some others. Is that what you're referring to? Are there other similarities? What would you say about the court of our era today, and what its similarity from those days?
Well, one thing that is similar to those days is that the court is a conservative influence now on American life, and it was a conservative influence during that period, and it caused a considerable amount of unrest in many quarters. And one can only hope that the long-term effects of some of the decisions that have happened in recent years aren't felt as strongly as some of the mistakes during Harlan's era. I will say, though, that another facet of the court today, obviously, is how deeply divided people are philosophically, judicially, and in philosophy. And yet, both sides admire Harlan. It's very interesting. Harlan has a lot of conservative supporters because they believe, conservatives who believe in a jurisprudence that focuses on the original intent of the Constitution and the text of the Constitution, see support for that in Harlan's defense of Black rights against the court's majority. That Harlan was essentially an originalist, that he was standing up for the specific intent of the post-Civil War amendments, and for the specific language when they say, equal protection of the laws, equal means equal, and that's what Harlan was saying. And so conservatives today will say, well, that's the proper interpretation, that he was standing up for the Constitution when other justices, even in the name of conservatism, was abandoning it. Liberals respect and admire Harlan because he cared about the result of the Supreme Court decisions. He cared about their effect on average people. He would often make that reference in his dissents. And he also cared about how they would guide the future of the country and the destiny of the country. Liberals admire that. So today, if you can imagine, if liberals and conservatives can find equal support in Harlan, he's one of the rare figures they can both admire, it can also help them to respect each other and see ways that things aren't quite as absolute and divided on the court as they should be.
We don't have time to go into it very much, but one of the things certainly we're going to hear in one of our questions that came in from Albert Alschuler, talking about, we certainly will hear conservatives quoting Harlan in the Plessy case, talking about the Constitution being colorblind.
It has been mentioned in the affirmative action debate. The Constitution is colorblind, right. So why would you ever see this? Now, Thurgood Marshall was asked about that in the 1980s, and he said, "Look, if the country had listened to Harlan way back when, we wouldn't need affirmative action. We only have affirmative action because they didn't listen to Harlan." Right. I think it's an open question whether Harlan would support or oppose affirmative action on the grounds affirmative action as a a remedy for the years of segregation and the years of past discrimination. And I think it's an open question whether Harlan would have, how Harlan would have regarded that.
Another question, and we are about to run out of time here. Just time for one or two other quick things. A couple of people have asked from our congregation, Beth Braxton, others, is there a Harlan out there today? Is there somebody who we're going to look back on as a great dissenter or some wise beyond their time? Maybe too early to say that, but what are your thoughts when people ask you that?
Well, my personal thought is no, but I think that some of the dissenters on the court, because they see the effect that Harlan's dissents have had, have said that they want to be regarded as a Harlan. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was one who cited Harlan as a justice whose legacy she wanted to be similar to her own, because she issued a lot of dissents and she wanted them to be regarded. I think that's a very logical kind of take on Harlan's career, that he showed the importance of dissent, that it's not just a pro forma kind of registering your disapproval. It's a roadmap to change, and that it can help lead to change. And whatever your judicial philosophy is, you can embrace the concept of dissent in that spirit.
Thank you. There's so much else we could talk about, but we are nearly out of time. Let me just ask you a final question, if you will. If asked to summarize in a few sentences, what would you say to people about why Harlan is such an important figure? What are the main things you would highlight?
Well, I would say that the era that he was on the Supreme Court was a very dark era in legal history, and especially when you think about the segregation era and Plessy v. Ferguson and the extent to which the Supreme Court was out of touch with what was going on in America. The fact that Harlan was in touch, created this sort of one flame of hope that kept sort of faith in the system alive during that period. And I think that was a very important contribution by itself, more than even the doctrines that he spun, or the fact that he was sort of ended up being on the right side of history in so many areas. I think it was that symbolic sense of the one against the many that prevented things from being unanimous. It says that, here in the United States, we do not have one group of oppressors and one group of victims, that, things can be fluid and things can change, and white people can see things through the eyes of Black people. And I think that was a very important statement. And I think that it's a unique statement in American legal history. And so to understand the history of American law in the Supreme Court, you really have to understand the Harlan story. And it isn't just important historically, it's sort of important as a model for where judicial wisdom comes from and what's really important in these Supreme Court decisions. So that's why I'm a believer in this story, and I do enjoy and respect and thank so much the people of New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, the people of the other churches that came together tonight. And I so appreciate the opportunity to just talk about this story. And I hope that people find some strength in this book too.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. And your description of him quoting someone who talked about he was someone who went to bed every night with a Bible in one hand and the Constitution in the other. I think that's a great summary of his approach to his work as a jurist and just as a human being. So as we come to a close, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I also want to really urge everybody to get this book and read it. Get it from the library or buy it, even better. You will enjoy it. It is a fascinating story. I told my wife about it when I was reading it, and she said, "Oh my goodness, they should make a movie of that." The story of Robert Harlan and his impact on Justice Harlan and the other influences on his life really are fascinating. And I assure you, you will enjoy the book and you'll learn a tremendous amount. I also invite you now to take a couple of minutes and type into chat as we conclude answer to this question. What did you learn about the life and work of Justice Harlan that was most interesting or important to you? Just take a moment and share some thoughts. Many of you said when you signed on you didn't know much about Justice Harlan. So what did you learn that was helpful or interesting in the program tonight? As you do that, I want to just make a quick announcement or two, and then we will sign off. I want to tell you about our next program. In the next program, McClendon Scholar Program, will be another in our series of authors. We will have Kristen Henning, who is a member of the Metropolitan AME Church, who we have been talking about tonight, a church that we work with very closely in many different ways. And Kristen has written a really powerful book called The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And she'll be talking about her book on Wednesday evening, October 26th. And we will send out information about that. But mark that on your calendar now and be aware of that. Also want just to remind you of the website for our program. It's the New York Avenue website, nyapc.org/McClendon-SIR. And this has recordings of almost every program we've had over the last couple of years. And indeed, a link to the recording of this program will be up on that website in the next few days. So you can share that with others, or you can go and view this program again if you want to go over it and some things that were said. And there's the website again on nyapc.org, and then you click on McClendon Scholar on that homepage, or you go ahead and type in McClendon-SIR. And news about upcoming programs are always found there also. So again, thank you for being with us tonight. I wish we had another hour to talk about this fascinating book. But I urge you to really learn about it on your own and explore it. And we're so thankful you joined us, and we look forward to seeing you another time.